Good morning. I'm going to dedicate today's class to the refuah shalema of our classmate and friend Avram ben Devoida, Avram ben Nussin HaKoyen, who is going to have a successful surgery today, God willing. That's the plan. Okay, so first to answer the questions of the research we're talking about. So point one was, the Alter Rebbe writes that someone who doesn't have to lean, doesn't have to recline, and reclines is considered hedged a simpleton. And we struggled to think about who that might be. It's either you're required to recline or you're not allowed to recline. There's very little or almost no circumstances in which someone is not required, could, and therefore if did, is considered a simpleton. Right? It's not ever said, if you're not required to recline, you recline anyway, considered a simpleton. Right? So if you're in the presence of your teacher, you're not allowed to recline. If you're in just an ordinary adult male, then you have to recline. The only option was a woman, whom we said relies on the view which said that nowadays reclining isn't the thing. She's not aware of it, but that's the halach position we give for them, considering that they don't.
It's a decision.
Yeah. So that would be the only case which we suggested that might be one who's not supposed, could recline, doesn't have to recline, and would be considered, quote, hedged simpleton if they did. So I actually looked up in the footnotes there, they have like sources there. So one of the Rabbi Shapiro from Miami wrote in one of the early Torah journals in Chabad called Yagdal Torah. He wrote this question. He said one of his students asked him, and he leaves it with a question, doesn't have the answer. And he rejects the idea that it means a woman, because he finds sources which indicate that if a woman decides to recline, she actually is praiseworthy. Because that's the primary view. The primary view is that reclining is still a thing. And if reclining is still a thing, and we have the halacha that nowadays all women are considered women of prestige and therefore are required to recline, so it actually is praiseworthy if she does. Okay, that's what he says. Now, I'll still maintain that we're talking about a woman here because the Alter didn't quote that. Anyway, it just indicates that this question is not, we're not the first ones to think of this question. It's still something to think about. There's another source he cites to. Sorry? Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. The other source he cites to, a book called Sharei Shalom, which I believe is Rabbi Shalom Spalter from Morristown, who writes about this subject. But I couldn't find it on my digital library. I couldn't find where he discusses it. So maybe he has a suggested answer to the question. You know what you said?
I didn't hear you said in the presence of your teacher, you do not recline.
Depending on what kind of teacher. If your teacher gives you permission, then you do. But if it's a teacher whom you learn or the majority of your Torah is learned from this one specific person, then if you're sitting at their table, not required.
At the Rebbe's table.
So at the Rebbe's table, even if he doesn't teach you, you're not allowed to recline.
Okay.
That's what the halach was, right? Okay, so the Jerusalem Talmud actually was not, the context there is not reclining. Context there is something else entirely. But the phrasing there is taken from there. The phrasing of someone who takes on a stringency when he's not supposed, when he doesn't have to, is considered, is considered simpleton, not considered praiseworthy, which itself is a principle that has to be unpacked because sometimes we actually do go beyond the letter of the law. Right. We once discussed this. Alter says, depending on whether it can bother someone else, depending on whether there's an arrogance to it, there's different circumstances in which we say, yes, take on the stringency, and sometimes we say don't. So the phrasing comes from the Jerusalem Talmud. The source is the Magen Avram, the Taz, who both quote a Marshal. Now, the way the Taz phrases it actually, considering that you'd be considered a simpleton if you recline when you're not supposed to, he actually says it's forbidden to. Also. Anyway. So that's with respect to that subject. Anyway, it's still open-ended. And it still requires some investigation as to what the Alter Rebbe means when he says that if you're not supposed to, and you do, considered a simpleton, or if you're exempt and you do, you're a simpleton, considering that either you're required or you're not supposed to. One of the two. Okay. it's still open for discussion. The other thing we want to discuss was the karpas, right? So we said from the Rebbe's Haggadah that considering the fact that the Alter Rebbe in his instructions on his Haggadah does not mention whether to recline or not recline during karpas, therefore said the Rebbe, this would be considered like any other food that you eat at night, which either you're allowed to or you don't have to, right? And which the Shulchan Aruch said if you do recline, praiseworthy, whereas the Chabad custom is not to. Yeah, and that's how we treat karpas, which is why the Alter Rebbe doesn't have an instruction recline or don't recline, because it's up to you. And the Alter Rebbe only puts the instruction when you're not allowed to, like marar, when you shouldn't, or when you have to, like matzah and the 4 cups. Okay. Then there was another paragraph there, where the Rebbe inserted this little paragraph which said, the majority of opinion says that karpas you don't need to recline, and they were put in the footnote the sources, and then they put one source which says you should be reclining by karpas. That's what we have. That's what we have in that paragraph. Yeah? Okay. So firstly, that paragraph was actually added years later. A number of times the Rebbe revisited his own Haggadah and added some new notes. So that paragraph came years later, which is why it's in a separate paragraph. In other words, first the Rebbe saying at the beginning, giving us the background, commenting on the Rebbe's Haggadah, which leaves no instruction as to recline or not recline, telling us that the reason is because it's up to you, like any other food items that night, and then concludes with the Chabad custom that we don't. Okay? Years later, the Rebbe adds, by the way, you should know, there's a discussion amongst the sages, amongst the halachic authorities, whether you should or shouldn't. Yeah. So I looked at some of the sources, and I think what they're trying to do is like this. Most of the sources, that's what the Rebbe said, that's what the Rebbe writes, most of the authorities say you don't recline during karpas. Right? Now, if most of the authorities say you don't recline during karpas, and if they say you shouldn't recline during karpas, then that poses a question on the Rebbe's interpretation of the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe's interpretation of the Alter Rebbe is that the reason why he doesn't say whether to recline or not is because it's up to you. Well, if the majority of the authorities say you don't, then the Alter Rebbe should actually say don't recline. Which is why the Rebbe says there, it's the majority, but there is a view that says you could recline. In other words, the Rebbe is substantiating years later what he said years earlier. When he said years earlier that it's up to you, he's putting sources to say, well, because you see that there's a discussion.
The majority is that.
Majority is don't, but there is still the opinion which says you should.
People can rely on
and therefore the Alter Rebbe can consider it like any other food item of the night in which you can choose whether you want to or not. So perhaps that's what the Rebbe is doing in that comment in that paragraph to substantiate what he said years earlier. Furthermore, those views which say at karpas you shouldn't recline, some of them actually go so far as to say not just you don't have to recline, but actually you shouldn't. Right? The reason they say that is not because of the inherent nature of karpas, but because there's all kinds of allusions embedded in karpas to the suffering, to the affliction. Inherently, the eating of karpas on the basic halachic reason is simply to make the kids ask the questions. From that perspective, it is indeed like any other food item, with no particular relationship to either the oppression or the freedom. Like marar to the oppression, no reclining, matzah to the freedom, yes, reclining. Karpas is neither of those in essence. It's just to make the kid ask questions. Right? Even the saltwater element is a secondary element. The primary element of the karpas is to make the kid ask questions. We haven't started eating it, and you're dipping, what are we doing? The primary element. So these sources which say you shouldn't recline, some of them say, it should be treated like marar, but only in its tangential sense. Because it's like a karpas has numerical value of, what was it? Some numerical value in the word karpas that indicates that it's talking about oppression or some other associations. Right? And I think that's what they were citing to. They was telling us that even though there are those that say you shouldn't recline during karpas, it's not an absolute prohibition like marar. And furthermore, there's an opinion which says you could recline or you should recline. And therefore, out there, we'll treat it like any other food item, which inherently can go either way. That's perhaps what the Rebbe is doing in that little paragraph. Okay.
It's minhagim.
Mm-hmm.
So he's really being fair here.
That's the point. In other words, if there was a dry halacha which said like Mara, don't recline, then the Alter Rebbe should have inserted it there. Don't recline. Or if there's a dry halacha which says you should recline, then he should have inserted it, should recline. And the fact that there's no mention of whether to yes recline or no recline, the Rebbe is understanding that to mean that the Alter Rebbe is learning that this karpas is to be treated like anything else you eat in that meal, which you can decide if you want to or not. Right? Which is why I think the Rebbe has to substantiate and say, there's many opinions which say you don't have to recline, but there is an opinion which says you should. Which would then, I guess, further substantiate the position of the Alter Rebbe that says, treat it like any other food and decide whether you want to or not. I think that's what they was trying to do.